The dust of Benton's Ridge settled slowly in the wake of the departing stagecoach, hanging in the stagnant afternoon air like a veil of crushed bone. The sun, a heavy copper disk, beat down mercilessly upon the weathered wooden facades of the buildings that lined the main thoroughfare, baking the raw timber until it smelled faintly of resin and old despair. Standing utterly motionless upon the warped planks of the boardwalk was Abigail Hartwell. She was a woman whose posture spoke of an iron rod fused to her spine, dressed in mourning clothes that were far too heavy for the brutal heat of the high plains. The black fabric absorbed the sunlight, turning her into a silhouette against the bleached, sun-scorched backdrop of the settlement. At her feet sat two large, leather-bound trunks, their brass fittings tarnished, but speaking of a life of considerable means that had, until very recently, been her reality. She was a widow of only 3 months, and she had come to this desolate edge of the world to claim the vast estate and holdings her late husband had supposedly secured. Instead, she had found nothing but closed doors, averted eyes, and the chilling realization that she was entirely alone in a place that devoured the vulnerable without a second thought. Her gaze, dark and unblinking, was fixed upon the heavy oak doors of the institution across the street, a building that bore the imposing title of First Territorial Bank. It was the only structure in Benton's Ridge built of brick, a testament to the concentrated power and wealth hoarded within its walls. Less than an hour ago, she had sat in the plush, suffocatingly warm office of Silas Crenshaw, the man who controlled not only the finances of the town, but its very heartbeat. He had smiled at her, a superficial, pitying expression that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes, and had spoken in a voice that was soft, cultured, and entirely lethal. He had informed her, with a terrible, polite finality, that her husband's estate was severely encumbered. There were debts, he had claimed, massive, unrecorded debts that had surfaced upon the man's demise. The vast tracts of land, the herds of cattle, the silent partnerships in local businesses, all of it was tied up in a labyrinth of legal claims and promissory notes held conveniently by First Territorial Bank itself. Until the probate was settled, a process he assured her would take years, her assets were entirely frozen. She had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back, the trunks at her feet, and a few worthless coins in her reticule. Abigail did not weep. She had exhausted her tears during the long, agonizing nights beside her husband's deathbed, and she possessed a practical, deeply ingrained dignity that refused to allow her to shatter in public. Instead, she stood in the suffocating heat and calculated her survival. She was a woman of sharp intellect, highly educated in a world that preferred women to be merely decorative, and she possessed a mind that worked with the precision of a master watchmaker. She knew how to balance ledgers, how to manage complex households, how to find the hidden flaws in a seemingly perfect column of numbers. But out here, surrounded by hardened men and a hostile landscape, those skills seemed terribly abstract. The townspeople walked past her, giving her a wide berth, their eyes sliding away in that universal gesture of self-preservation that occurs when a community witnesses a public ruin. They knew what Silas Crenshaw had done. They knew he was a predatory pillar of the community, a man who built his empire on the shattered foundations of those who were too weak, too naive, or too unfortunate to defend themselves, and they knew better than to offer comfort to his latest victim. Across the wide, dusty expanse of the street, shadowed beneath the overhang of the local livery stable, Caleb Stone watched her. He was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited, tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by years of harsh sun and biting wind. He stood with a stillness that was not the frozen shock of the widow, but the coiled, deliberate calm of a predator at rest. He was known throughout the territory simply as the landowner, a solitary rancher who commanded a vast, isolated spread miles outside the town limits. But the older residents, those who remembered the bloody, chaotic early days of the settlement, knew he had once been a man of violence, a gunslinger whose name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones. He had long since traded his revolvers for the heavy tools of ranching, building high fences around his property, and even higher ones around his heart. He was a widower himself, a man who had buried his past alongside his heart, choosing a life of quiet, unyielding isolation. Yet, beneath his emotionally guarded exterior, there remained a fierce, uncompromising sense of justice, a moral compass that had never quite aligned with the corrupt, opportunistic pragmatism of Benton's Ridge. Caleb leaned against a wooden support post, the rough bark catching against his heavy canvas coat, and observed the woman's isolation. He saw the way the town abandoned her, the way the merchant's wife hurriedly crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her, the way the idle ranch hands snickered outside the saloon. He felt a slow, familiar anger kindling in his chest, a quiet disgust for the cowardice of the collective. He knew Silas Crenshaw's methods intimately. The banker was a coward who preyed on those who could not fight back, using legal trickery and social pressure as weapons just as deadly as a bullet. The landowner watched the widow's face, noting the rigid set of her jaw, the absence of panic in her eyes. She was terrified, he knew, but she was refusing to let it break her. There was a resilience in her stance that commanded his respect, a quiet, stubborn strength that resonated with the deeply buried parts of his own soul. He watched as she finally moved, grasping the heavy leather handles of her trunks, attempting to drag them toward the meager shade of the boardwalk awning. The physical effort was immense, her black mourning dress gathering the pale dust, but she did not ask for help, and none was offered. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the street. Abigail, exhausted and parched, finally abandoned the trunks against the wall of the general store. She needed shelter, and she needed time to think, to untangle the legal web Silas Crenshaw had thrown over her life. She walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the only respectable boarding house in town, a modest, whitewashed building situated at the end of the street. Inside, the dining room was dim and smelled of boiled cabbage and old lye soap. The proprietor, a nervous woman who owed her own mortgage to First Territorial Bank, looked at the widow with a mixture of pity and terror, shaking her head before a single word could be spoken. The message was clear. There was no room at the inn for an enemy of the banker. Abigail turned away, her throat tight with a despair she refused to voice. She walked back out into the fading light, the reality of her destitution settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She had no money, no shelter, and no allies. She was entirely at the mercy of a town that had already decided to let her starve. As the evening shadows lengthened, merging into a uniform, dusty twilight, she found herself sitting on a wooden bench outside the closed doors of the stagecoach office, staring blankly at her hands. The street had quieted, the respectable citizens retreating to their homes, leaving the night to the rowdy laughter spilling from the saloons. She felt a profound, terrifying emptiness. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability that a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and saw a man approaching. He did not walk with the swagger of the ranch hands or the hurried, nervous step of the townsfolk. He moved with a silent, deliberate grace, his boots making almost no sound on the wooden planks. He stopped a few feet away, respecting her space, and slowly removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing dark hair threaded with silver and a face that was a study in hard angles and deep, sorrowful lines. It was Caleb Stone. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding the quiet, steady weight of a man who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. Abigail stiffened, drawing her dark shawl tighter around her shoulders, bracing herself for another insult or a demand she could not meet. But the man did not speak immediately. He looked at her trunks, then back to her face, his gaze penetrating but devoid of the predatory gleam she had seen in Silas Crenshaw's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like the sound of distant thunder rolling across the plains. It was a voice unused to idle chatter, rough with disuse but profoundly steady. He did not offer empty platitudes or insulting charity. Instead, he made a statement of fact. He told her that he had a ranch, a massive spread 10 miles out of town, and that his ledgers were a disaster. He said he was a man who understood cattle and land, but not the intricate, maddening columns of numbers that the modern cattle trade required. He stated, plainly and without inflection, that he needed a bookkeeper, someone meticulous and educated, to bring order to his chaotic accounts. He offered her a room in his main house, board, and a fair wage, in exchange for her absolute discretion and her skill with a pen. The widow stared at him, her mind racing. This was not the intervention she had expected. There was no pity in his offer, no expectation of gratitude. It was a transaction, cold and practical, framed in a way that preserved her dignity entirely. She studied his face, looking for the hidden hook, the inevitable cost of such sudden grace, but she saw only a quiet, resolute honesty. She realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that this man was offering her a lifeline, not out of charity, but because he recognized her competence and required it. She took a slow, deep breath, the dry air burning her lungs, and asked him his name. He gave it, a simple, unadorned title, and she recognized it from the hushed gossip she had overheard on the stagecoach. He was the gunslinger turned rancher, the solitary man who tolerated no fools and owed no debts. She weighed her options, which were entirely non-existent, against the steady, uncompromising presence of the man before her. With a slow, deliberate nod, she accepted his offer. She told him she required a desk, good light, and access to every single financial record he possessed. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute agreement, and effortlessly hoisted her heavy trunks onto his broad shoulders, leading her toward his waiting wagon. The journey to the ranch was undertaken in profound silence. The wagon rattled over the rutted dirt road, the darkness pressing in on all sides, illuminated only by the pale, cold light of a rising moon. Abigail sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside him, the physical distance between them small, but the emotional distance vast. She was acutely aware of his presence, the steady, rhythmic movement of his hands on the reins, the faint, comforting smell of leather, wood smoke, and clean sweat that emanated from him. He did not attempt to make conversation, did not ask about her past or pry into the fresh, bleeding wounds of her grief. He simply drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, offering her the profound, healing gift of silence. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the tight, suffocating band of panic around her chest begin to loosen. She was still destitute, still a stranger in a hostile land, but she was no longer entirely adrift. She had a purpose, a task to apply her formidable intellect toward, and she had the quiet, unspoken protection of the man beside her. They arrived at the ranch long after midnight. The house was a sprawling, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs and fieldstone, sitting dark and silent beneath the vast canopy of stars. Caleb showed her to a room on the ground floor, a space that was Spartan but immaculately clean, containing a heavy iron bed, a washstand, and a large oak desk positioned beneath a wide window. He placed her trunks at the foot of the bed, lit a single kerosene lamp, and turned to leave. He paused at the door, his large frame filling the frame, and told her that breakfast was at dawn, and the ledgers were in the study across the hall. He wished her a good night, his voice low and respectful, and closed the door softly behind him. The widow stood alone in the centre of the room, the yellow light of the lamp pushing back the shadows. She walked to the desk, running a hand over the smooth, polished wood, feeling a sudden, unexpected surge of determination. She would not simply survive this exile, she would conquer it. She would take this man's chaotic numbers and force them into perfect, undeniable order. The next morning began the arrangement, a daily rhythm that would slowly, inexorably forge a bond between two deeply isolated souls. Abigail awoke before the sun, dressing in her most practical, unadorned gown, and stepped out into the cool, silent house. She found the study exactly where he had said it would be, a room smelling of old tobacco and dusty paper. Stacked upon a massive wooden table were years of ledgers, receipts, and bank statements, a chaotic mountain of financial history that would have driven a lesser mind to despair. She sat down, sharpened a pencil with a small knife she carried in her pocket, and went to work. For hours she lost herself in the numbers, her mind moving with swift, terrifying precision through the tangled columns. She discovered errors, omissions, and a systemic lack of organization that spoke of a man who cared deeply for his land but despised the paperwork it generated. But as she dug deeper, cross-referencing old bank statements with recent bills of sale, she began to notice a pattern. It was a subtle, insidious bleeding of funds, disguised as exorbitant interest rates, unexplained fees, and phantom debts. And all of the irregularities pointed back to one source: Silas Crenshaw. While she worked, Caleb went about the brutal, demanding labor of running the ranch. He was a man who led by example, working alongside his hands, his muscles burning with the effort of mending fences, breaking horses, and managing the vast herds of cattle. But despite the physical exhaustion, he found his thoughts constantly drifting back to the silent, fiercely focused woman in his study. He had hired her on a whim, driven by an instinct he hadn't questioned, a sudden, overpowering need to pull her out of the firing line of the town's cruelty. He had expected her to struggle, to complain about the isolation or the sheer volume of the mess he had handed her. Instead, she had attacked the ledgers with the silent, ruthless efficiency of a general prosecuting a war. He would pass the open door of the study, pausing for just a moment to observe her. He watched the way the morning light caught the stray hairs escaping her severe bun, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the precise, elegant movements of her hands as she turned the pages. He felt a deep, quiet respect blooming in his chest, a profound admiration for her resilience and her undeniable competence. Their interactions were sparse, confined mostly to the shared meals in the large, echoing dining room. They ate in a comfortable silence, passing dishes without the need for polite, meaningless chatter. But slowly, subtly, the silence began to shift in texture. It was no longer the silence of two strangers guarding their respective griefs. It became a shared space, a quiet communion of two people who understood the value of words and refused to waste them. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and gold, he walked into the study carrying 2 tin cups of steaming bitter coffee. He set one down on the edge of her desk, a small, practical offering that spoke volumes more than any flowery compliment. She looked up from the ledger, her eyes meeting his, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. There was no passion in the gaze, no sudden, overwhelming romance, but rather a profound, vibrating recognition. She saw the honourable, weary man beneath the fearsome reputation, and he saw the brilliant, unbroken woman beneath the widow's weeds. She reached for the cup, her fingers brushing the warm tin, and offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent since her arrival. It was during the 3rd week of her employment that the true depth of the deception was revealed. Abigail sat in the study, the lamp burning late into the night, surrounded by stacks of paper she had meticulously categorized and cross-referenced. She had traced the flow of money back a decade, unearthing a complex, highly illegal scheme orchestrated by Silas Crenshaw. The banker had been systematically skimming profits from the ranch's cattle sales, inflating the cost of supplies bought on credit, and forging signatures on promissory notes that did not exist. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out in her elegant, precise handwriting across a newly created master ledger. She had not only brought order to the chaos, she had armed the landowner with the proof he needed to destroy his enemy. She closed the ledger with a soft, definitive thud, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over her. She had proven her worth. She was no longer a destitute victim. She was an integral, indispensable partner in the survival of the ranch. The next morning, she presented her findings to Caleb. They sat at the heavy oak dining table, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She walked him through the numbers, her voice steady, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. She pointed to the forged signatures, the inflated interest rates, the phantom debts, explaining the mechanics of the fraud with the clarity of a seasoned investigator. The rancher listened in silence, his face a mask of carved stone, his eyes growing darker and colder with every word she spoke. He did not interrupt, did not question her methodology. He trusted her completely. When she finished, a heavy, pregnant silence filled the room. He reached out, his large, calloused hand resting gently on the cover of the master ledger, his fingers tracing the edge of the leather binding. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of terrible anger directed at the banker and profound, quiet gratitude directed at her. "You have saved this ranch," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. and you have given me the noose to hang him with." However, secrets in Benton's Ridge possessed a buoyancy that refused to let them stay submerged for long. Word of the widow's employment at the isolated ranch had spread quickly, carried on the eager tongues of gossips and idle ranch hands. The town, which had so easily abandoned her, now viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and prurient interest. They whispered about the impropriety of a woman living alone with a man of his violent reputation, spinning vicious, unfounded tales to justify their own prior cruelty. And inevitably, these whispers reached the manicured, predatory ears of Silas Crenshaw. The banker, secure in his web of corruption, had initially dismissed her survival as a temporary anomaly. But when his spies informed him that she was not acting as a housekeeper, but as a bookkeeper, a cold, slippery knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He knew the state of the rancher's ledgers. He had relied on their chaotic nature to hide his systematic theft for years. If the woman possessed even a fraction of the intellect she was rumoured to have, his entire empire was in jeopardy. The external threat materialized 3 days later, arriving at the ranch in a polished black buggy, drawn by 2 matched expensive geldings. Silas Crenshaw stepped down, his boots sinking slightly into the dust of the yard, adjusting his impeccably tailored suit with a superficial air of relaxed confidence. He was accompanied by 2 men, heavily armed thugs, employed by First Territorial Bank under the guise of security, their presence a silent, undeniable threat of violence. Caleb stood on the wide wooden porch, watching the approach with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He stood loosely, his hands hanging near his sides, his stance casual, but radiating a lethal readiness that made the 2 hired men hesitate. Abigail stood just behind him, framed in the doorway, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask. She held the master ledger tightly against her chest, a physical shield and a devastating weapon. Silas Crenshaw approached the porch, halting at the bottom of the steps, adopting a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. He spoke in his soft, cultured voice, addressing the rancher but directing his venom entirely at the widow. He spoke of the town's concern for her reputation, framing his visit as a matter of moral duty. He suggested, with a vicious, thinly veiled sarcasm, that her current living arrangement was highly improper, a scandal that was reflecting poorly on the entire community. He offered, with a magnanimous gesture that made her stomach churn, to forgive a small portion of her late husband's supposed debt if she would immediately vacate the premises and accept a position as a scullery maid in his own household where she could be properly supervised. It was a masterclass in psychological violence, an attempt to strip away her dignity and force her back into a position of helpless vulnerability. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not move a muscle. He simply stared down at the banker, his eyes flat and dead, the eyes of the gunslinger he had once been. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the tension in the air vibrating like a plucked wire. When he finally spoke, his words were precise, unhurried, and utterly devastating. He informed Silas Crenshaw that the lady was an employee of the ranch under his direct protection and that her reputation was unimpeachable. He then stated, in a tone that brooked absolutely no argument, that if the banker or any of his men ever set foot on his land again, he would consider it an act of trespass and respond accordingly. He did not make a threat. He stated a simple, immutable law of nature. The banker's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine fear briefly crossing his eyes as he recognized the absolute, uncompromising violence sleeping just beneath the rancher's calm exterior. He attempted to bluster, to issue a vague threat about calling in loans and leveraging the law, but the words sounded hollow, pathetic against the sheer, immovable force of the man on the porch. Silas Crenshaw turned, signaling his men, and climbed back into his buggy, his mind racing with desperate, panicked plans to destroy them before they could destroy him. The crucible moment arrived not with a legal summons, but with the smell of smoke. It was a moonless night, the darkness absolute, the air heavy and still, pressing down on the ranch like a physical weight. Abigail was asleep in her room, the master ledger locked safely in her desk, when she was awakened by a sound that did not belong in the quiet rhythm of the night. It was a crackling, snapping noise, accompanied by the frantic, terrified screams of horses. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of burning wood and pitch filling her nostrils. She threw off the blankets, not bothering with a robe, and ran into the hallway. Caleb was already there, pulling on his boots, his face a terrifying mask of controlled fury. "The barn," he said, his voice tight. "They've set the barn." He grabbed a rifle from a rack by the door and sprinted out into the night. She followed him, ignoring the rough ground tearing at her bare feet. The night was suddenly, violently illuminated. The main barn, a massive wooden structure housing the ranch's most valuable livestock and a winter's worth of dry hay, was engulfed in roaring, hungry flames. The fire had clearly been set deliberately, starting in 3 different places simultaneously, the work of men acting under the desperate orders of a cornered animal. The heat was immense, a physical wall that pushed her back, singeing the edges of her nightgown. The ranch hands were tumbling out of the bunkhouse, shouting, forming a chaotic, desperate bucket line from the water trough. But it was clear the structure was lost. The only hope was to save the animals trapped inside, their screams echoing horribly above the roar of the fire. Caleb did not hesitate. He threw his rifle to a ranch hand and charged toward the burning building, throwing his coat over his head to shield himself from the blistering heat. He kicked open the heavy side door, disappearing into the smoke and flame. Abigail stood for a fraction of a second, the primal urge to flee battling against a sudden, fierce loyalty that anchored her to the spot. She knew the Ledgers were safe in the house, but she also knew that without the prize-breeding stock trapped in that barn, the financial ruin of the ranch would be absolute, regardless of what the Ledgers proved. She ran toward the main doors, the massive, heavy wooden gates that were barred from the outside, a deliberate, murderous act by the arsonists to ensure the destruction was complete. The heat was agonizing, searing her lungs with every breath, turning the air into a toxic, choking fog. She reached the main doors, her hands grabbing the heavy iron bar that held them shut. The metal was blisteringly hot, burning the flesh of her palms, but she did not let go. She planted her bare feet in the dirt, ignoring the pain, and pulled with a strength she did not know she possessed. The bar groaned, resisting, the wood around it beginning to catch fire. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated effort, and threw her entire body weight backward. The iron bar shrieked and gave way, dropping into the dust. She hauled the heavy doors open just as a massive, terrified black stallion exploded through the gap, nearly trampling her in its panic. Behind the stallion came Caleb, his clothes smouldering, leading 2 more horses, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, desperate determination. The roof of the barn groaned a terrible structural scream and collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and roaring flame. The backdraft blew them both off their feet, throwing them hard into the dust of the yard. They lay there for a moment, the world reduced to the roaring sound of the fire, the shouting of the hands, and the ragged, burning intake of their own breath. Abigail pushed herself up on her elbows, coughing violently, her lungs screaming for clean air. She looked over and saw him lying on his back, staring up at the smoke-filled sky, his chest heaving. She crawled to him, panic clutching her throat, her burnt hands trembling. She reached out, touching his shoulder, her voice hoarse and raw. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, her formal, careful diction entirely stripped away by the raw terror of the moment. "Tell me you are not hurt." He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding hers in the chaotic, flickering light of the inferno. His face was a mask of soot and sweat, a nasty burn weeping on his cheek, but his eyes were remarkably clear. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the burns on her hands, the soot on her face, the fierce, undeniable courage that had driven her into the fire to save his livelihood. He reached up, his large hand gently catching hers, ignoring the pain of his own burns. The physical contact, the first they had ever shared, was a shock, a sudden grounding connection amidst the chaos. "I am whole," he said, his voice a rough whisper. He looked at her burnt palms, his jaw tightening. "You opened the doors. You burned your hands for my horses." It was not a question. It was a profound, staggering realization of her loyalty, a validation of the trust he had placed in her. They sat together in the dirt, the fire raging behind them, the danger passing into the realm of aftermath. The ranch hands were corralling the terrified horses, the immediate crisis managed, leaving the two of them isolated in a bubble of quiet, shocked intimacy. It was there, amidst the ashes and the smell of ruin, that the high fences finally fell. He held her hands gently, inspecting the burns, and began to speak. He spoke not of the fire or of the banker, but of his past. He confessed the grief that had driven him to isolation, the loss of a wife many years ago to a sudden, brutal fever, the desperate, violent years he had spent trying to outrun the pain, and the hollow, silent life he had built to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of agony again. He spoke of his fear of letting anyone close, of the absolute terror of caring for something that could be so easily taken away. Abigail listened, the heat of the fire warming her back, the heat of his hands warming hers. She did not offer platitudes or easy comfort. She offered him the truth of her own existence. She spoke of the sudden, devastating loss of her husband, the terrifying freefall into destitution, the cold, calculated cruelty of the town, and the profound, unexpected salvation she had found in the quiet, demanding work of his ledgers. She confessed her own fear of vulnerability, her desperate need to prove her competence, to build a fortress of logic and numbers to protect herself from a world that viewed her as disposable. They sat in the dust, two deeply scarred, intensely private people, stripping away the armor they had worn for years, their words forging a bond that was forged in fire and absolute, unflinching honesty. The vulnerable exchange permanently altered the landscape between them. They were no longer simply employer and employee. They were survivors, intimately bound by shared trauma and mutual profound respect. The sun rose over a changed world. The barn was a smouldering ruin, a black scar against the earth, but the horses were safe, and the master ledger remained locked in the desk. Caleb washed the soot from his face, his movements precise and purposeful, wrapping his burnt arm in clean linen. Abigail stood beside him, her own hands bandaged, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a cold, focused fury. The time for hiding behind numbers and fences was over. Silas Crenshaw had escalated the conflict from financial trickery to attempted murder, crossing a line that demanded a final, absolute reckoning. They did not speak of the vulnerable confessions of the night before. The emotional shift was a quiet, settled fact between them, a solid foundation upon which they now prepared to build their counterattack. They harnessed the surviving buggy horse, loaded the heavy, leather-bound ledger, and drove toward Benton's Ridge, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a weapon being drawn from its sheath. They arrived in town just as the morning activities were reaching their peak. The main street was crowded with merchants opening their doors, ranchers buying supplies, and the usual collection of idlers and gossips. The arrival of the landowner's buggy drew immediate, silent attention. The townspeople stopped and stared, noting the bandaged hands of the widow, the soot still clinging to the rancher's coat, the grim, unyielding set of their faces. They drove straight to the center of town, pulling up in front of the large, imposing brick facade of First Territorial Bank. Caleb stepped down, his movements slow and deliberate, his hand resting casually near the heavy revolver he had strapped to his hip for the first time in years. He did not draw the weapon, his mere presence, the sudden, terrifying resurrection of the gunslinger persona, was enough to freeze the street in absolute, breathless silence. He turned and offered his hand to Abigail, assisting her down from the buggy with a formal, profound respect that silenced the whispers of the gossips before they could even begin. She stepped onto the boardwalk, holding the heavy ledger against her chest, her posture radiating an authority that commanded the attention of every person on the street. She did not look at the crowd. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the doors of First Territorial Bank. As if summoned by the sheer weight of their presence, Silas Crenshaw appeared in the doorway. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but his face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the armed rancher and the woman holding the book that contained his ruin. He attempted to smile, a ghastly, trembling contortion of his lips, and opened his mouth to speak, to offer some smooth, placating lie, but Abigail did not let him. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the silent street. clear, precise, and entirely devoid of fear. She did not shout. She spoke with the practiced, devastating clarity of a prosecutor delivering a fatal blow. She addressed the town, turning slightly to ensure her voice carried to the men standing on the saloon porches and the women peering from the mercantile windows. She detailed the fraud, outlining the exact mechanisms Silas Crenshaw had used to bleed the ranch dry, the forged signatures, the phantom debts, the systemic, calculated theft that had been operating for years beneath the veneer of respectability. She opened the ledger, her bandaged hands turning the pages with deliberate, agonizing slowness, reading aloud the dates, the amounts, and the indisputable proof of his crimes. She exposed his cowardice, his greed, and the predatory nature of his power, stripping away his disguise and revealing the hollow, corrupt core of the man who had controlled their lives. Silas Crenshaw tried to interrupt, his voice high and panicked, demanding she be silenced, threatening lawsuits and calling for the town marshal. But the marshal, a quiet man who had long suspected the banker's nature but lacked the proof to act, simply stood on the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, watching the execution. The town, the collective entity that had so easily shunned the widow, now turned its collective gaze upon the banker. The silence shifted from shocked observation to a cold, rising anger. They saw the proof, undeniable and absolute, and they realized that the man who had ordered the burning of a neighbor's barn to cover his tracks was entirely capable of destroying any of them. Caleb stood beside her, a silent, immovable mountain, his eyes locked onto the banker, promising absolute, instantaneous death if the man made a single aggressive move. The confrontation was not a physical battle. It was a complete, systematic dismantling of the antagonist's social and financial power. He was ruined, his reputation shattered, his crimes exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the frontier. He turned and fled back into the bank, a broken, pathetic figure, the door closing behind him with a hollow, defeated sound. The street remained silent for a long moment, the dust swirling gently around the wheels of the buggy. Abigail closed the ledger, a profound, exhausting wave of relief washing over her. She had done it. She had secured her place, defended her partner, and destroyed the man who had tried to erase her. She turned to Caleb, handing him the heavy book. He took it, his hand brushing hers, his eyes warm and entirely free of the shadows that had haunted him for years. The external threat was neutralized, the power dynamic of the town permanently altered. They climbed back into the buggy, the crowd parting silently to let them pass. The whispers that followed them now filled with a grudging, profound respect. They drove out of town, leaving the shattered ruins of the banker's empire behind them, heading back toward the vast open space of the ranch, toward a future they had fought for and won together. It was later that evening, when the tension had finally bled out of their muscles and the quiet rhythm of the ranch had reasserted itself, that the proposal occurred. They were sitting on the wide wooden porch, the air cooling rapidly as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft, bruised colors. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of the crucible they had survived, but the overwhelming sensation was one of profound, hard-won peace. Abigail sat in a rocking chair, her bandaged hands resting in her lap, watching the first stars appear. Caleb sat on the top step, his long legs stretched out, whittling a piece of soft pine with his pocket knife. The silence between them was comfortable, deep, and heavily laden with unspoken truth. He stopped whittling, closed the knife with a soft click, and slipped it into his pocket. He turned to look at her, his expression serious, plain-spoken, and entirely devoid of the flowery, passionate rhetoric found in cheap novels. He was a practical man, and he framed his intentions in practical, undeniable terms. He spoke of the ranch, of the work that lay ahead to rebuild the barn, to manage the herds, to ensure the prosperity that her ledgers had secured. He stated clearly and without hesitation that he could not do it alone. He did not want to do it alone. He looked at her, his eyes steady, and pointed out that their arrangement, born of necessity and crisis, had evolved into a partnership of absolute equality. He respected her intellect. He admired her courage, and he had come to rely on her presence in a way that terrified and comforted him in equal measure. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. He did not ask her to love him with a burning, uncontrollable passion. He asked for her trust, her partnership, and her continued presence in his life. He contrasted their current arrangement with the permanent future he desired, stating plainly that he no longer wanted her to stay as a bookkeeper or as an employee, but as his wife. It was a proposal built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared hardship, and the quiet, undeniable recognition that they were profoundly better together than they were apart. He offered her a life of hard work, yes, but also a life of absolute security, unwavering loyalty, and the quiet, fierce devotion of a man who had finally opened his heart to the world again. Abigail listened, the words settling into her soul like rain on parched earth. She looked at the man before her, seeing the burns on his hands, the soot still ingrained in the lines of his face, the absolute, unshakable integrity that defined his every action. She thought of her past, the superficial wealth, the sudden betrayal, the terrifying isolation, and she realized that true security was not found in bank vaults or social standing, but in the quiet, unyielding character of the person standing beside you in the fire. She did not hesitate. Her acceptance was as plain-spoken and direct as his proposal. She told him that she would stay, that she would manage his ledgers, help him rebuild the barn, and stand beside him, not as a dependent, but as a full and equal partner. She reached out, her bandaged hand resting gently on his shoulder, sealing a covenant that was stronger than any legal document forged in the crucible of their shared survival. A year later, the landscape of Benton's Ridge had shifted considerably. The heavy brick building that once housed First Territorial Bank was now occupied by a mercantile cooperative, the corrupt empire of Silas Crenshaw having collapsed entirely after the public exposure of his fraud. The town itself had grown, the atmosphere lighter, the oppressive weight of the banker's influence replaced by a cautious, pragmatic optimism. But the most profound changes had occurred 10 miles outside the town limits, on the vast spread of the ranch. The scars of the fire were gone. In place of the smouldering ruins stood a new barn, larger and sturdier than the last, built with timber paid for by the recovered funds and the honest hard work of the ranch hands. The herds had multiplied, the fences were mended, and the ledgers, still managed with ruthless, meticulous precision, reflected a prosperity that was undeniable and secure. The couple was now deeply respected within the community. When they rode into town for supplies, they were greeted not with suspicion or averted eyes, but with genuine, respectful nods. The gossips had found new targets, their vicious tales silenced by the undeniable reality of the couple's quiet, dignified success. Abigail was no longer the resilient outsider, the destitute widow begging for scraps. She was the formidable, respected matriarch of the most successful ranch in the territory, a woman whose intellect was sought after for advice on matters of business and organization. Caleb had not lost his fearsome aura, the quiet lethality of the gunslinger still resting just beneath the surface. But the shadows in his eyes had vanished, replaced by the steady, calm light of a man who was deeply, quietly content. The story concluded as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the plains. The air was warm, smelling of sweet grass and the clean scent of the newly built pine barn. The couple sat together on the wide wooden porch, the day's labour finished, the quiet rhythm of the evening settling over the land. Abigail held a small, leather-bound notebook, reviewing the final tallies of the spring cattle drive, her pencil moving with quick, practiced strokes. Caleb sat beside her, sipping from a tin cup of coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon, watching a newly born foal testing its legs in the near pasture. The silence between them was profound, a living, breathing entity that spoke of absolute trust, shared history, and a deeply earned peace. He turned his head, watching her profile, noting the way the fading light caught the silver threads that had begun to appear in her dark hair. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers, stilling the movement of her pencil. She looked up, a small, genuine smile touching her lips, recognizing the gesture. They did not need to speak of the initial crisis, of the terrifying isolation, or the fire that had tested them. Those memories were part of the foundation, the solid bedrock upon which their current contentment was built. They sat together in the fading light, looking out over the thriving, peaceful ranch, the physical manifestation of their shared resilience. It was an image of quiet dignity, a testament to the power of practical grace and the profound, enduring strength of a partnership forged in the harshest of conditions, a shared and permanently secured future.